Well, the United States is ramping up additional assets, money, weapons to the Middle East. Israel says it will wipe Iran off the face of the earth if Hezbollah intervenes in Gaza. The Turks seem to be motivated to mediate. We heard from Erdogan over the past few minutes saying he would like to mediate a peace. This flies in the face of what Secretary of State Antony Blinken just said over the weekend, which is we're not interested in any kind of ceasefire, which is unbelievable. Joining me now is Colonel Douglas MacGregor, who just wrote a new piece saying that the Biden administration should lead the charge to support a ceasefire. Colonel, it appears they're really going in the opposite direction with Blinken's comments yesterday and now Erdogan coming out and saying, hey, we're happy to mediate a peace here.
No, I think that's true. And it looks as though the same people controlling events in Jerusalem are controlling events in Washington. And they are unanimous in their desire for a major war. And I don't think people understand the implications. People are viewing this as Hamas as an enemy that richly deserves to be destroyed. There's no argument about that. The problem is, if you want to destroy Hamas, how do you go about doing it? And collective punishment that involves 2.2 million people is not a very popular way to do business. And particularly at this point in time, because the whole region is seething with anger over the attacks on the civilians in Gaza. There's no debate in the rest of the region about who's responsible. It's Israel. So you have the Israelis and all of their neighbors talking past each other. We are in a position to somehow or another address that and move this out of the realm of inevitable regional war into something more manageable. But there doesn't seem to be any interest in doing so.
The United States moving aircraft carriers, additional assets into the region. You make the point that this, you're right there involved in this. This is a very dangerous prospect for the United States.
Oh, it is. And people don't seem to understand that today's Middle East is radically different from the Middle East of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. The last major war was the 73 war, where Egypt and Syria attacked Israel, and Israel ultimately prevailed, although it was from time to time touch and go. Today, the Arab states are far more, I would argue, cohesive. The governments are stronger. They have more technology at their disposal, and there's a greater willingness to weigh in collectively. And today, we're also talking about Turkey and Iran as playing a major role, and as a result, Russia. Russia cannot sit idly by if Iran ends up being attacked by us. It will feel obligated to intervene because the Iranians have supported the Russians against the Ukrainian proxies. So this has the ingredients in it for a very major war. Now we're escalating across the boards. We seem to think that escalation works. We've tried that in Ukraine. We've escalated and escalated and escalated, and today Ukraine is in ruins. My great fear is that if this regional war unfolds as I think it might, there may be no Israel at the end of it.
You're right. You write in your piece that Israel could become the next Ukraine if we don't watch out. How do you mean?
Well, first of all, Hezbollah that sits up in the north is not simply backed by Iran, but we estimate they have 100 to 150,000 of their own fighters. Plus, some estimates are between 130,000 and 140,000 rockets and missiles, of which at least 40,000 are extremely precise. Now, there's enough armament in Hezbollah to destroy half of Israel. Hezbollah has made it clear that if, in fact, the Israelis march into Gaza with the objective of rooting out Hamas and without regard, frankly, to the loss of life there, and let's be honest, if you're going to march into a city and fight, the notion that you can pick and choose your targets is absurd. So the loss of life will be enormous. This is the catalyst for a regional war. And the Iranians have said it. The Turks have said it. Everyone has said this is unacceptable. King Hussein, or not Hussein, but Abdullah in Jordan gave a brilliant speech in Cairo explaining that he shared the Israelis' horror at what had happened to them, and thought that they had responded reasonably under the circumstances, but said collective punishment that involves 2.2 million people and driving them out of their homes and into the desert is simply unacceptable. And this is an impasse because we have a full court press in the United States to emphasize why we should be doing this, why we should be co-belligerence with Israel. And that's effectively what we're becoming in a very real sense. And that puts us at risk of confrontation with Iran, with the Turks, and with Russia.
Israel over the weekend saying that they will consider civilians who are in the northern part remain in North Gaza terrorist accomplices, quoting. The Israeli military has told Palestinian civilians living there that if they don't evacuate south, they will be considered an accomplice in a terrorist organization. So trying to root out Hamas, going into these caves, this is going to be an absolute disaster. It's going to be, I mean, we've already seen how much of a disaster this is. And the Israeli infantry going in, talk about that part of it, going into these cave structures where Hamas has been holed up and living in these massive booby-trapped caves. I've talked to some Israeli sources who tell me that they are absolutely terrified what's going to happen to the infantry if they go in. They will be slaughtered by the structures that are underneath those cities and underneath North Gaza. Can you speak on that, the military strategy of this on the part of the Israelis?
Well, keep in mind that the Israeli Defense Force on the ground consists of a small portion of professional soldiers. The vast majority of people that are being mobilized are simply civilians. They're reservists. I've been told that these reservists are not nearly as well trained and prepared as their predecessors were in 1973. That means that they have even less training and less preparation than you would want for such a complex operation. But let's assume you have a couple of weeks to train. You're not going to reach the level of expertise that you would want to deal with what you're describing, these tunnels. And remember that the Israelis have destroyed most of this area in northern Gaza, which makes it much easier for Hamas to defend itself. When you leave buildings intact, you're always at risk of bad things happening, but you have a way to navigate through it to root out the enemy. Now that everything has been rubbled, you have no idea where you're headed and what you're doing. Now, I'm sure the Israelis will use everything at their disposal: persistent surveillance overhead, careful targeting of anything they think is hostile, and I'm sure that the soldiers on the ground will do the best they can. But that's still not going to prevent you from taking very heavy casualties for all the reasons that you cite, IEDs and so forth. Now, there is one other possibility, and that is that the Israelis may decide to use fuel-air explosive. And fuel-air explosive over a square, let's say a couple of square miles, essentially sucks all the oxygen out of the area and then ignites it into a fireball. We use these things in Vietnam. They could certainly use these things against both Hamas and Hezbollah. And frankly, I think for their purposes, it would be necessary. But imagine the response of the region. Imagine how the Turks and the Iranians, the Egyptians, Jordanians, Saudis, Syrians, everyone will feel when they witness this. Again, I don't see this as a very positive outcome for Israel. And I think we're grossly underestimating the military potential of those lining up against Israel. And remember, Russia does not want to be in this. Right. Russia wants to remain neutral. But Russia's relationship with Iran is very, very close. And if you attack Iran, you're going to end up at war with Russia.
Is the center of all of this MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, of course, Saudi Arabia, maybe the most important man in the world at this moment? I've heard that thrown around over the past few days. The idea of a unified Muslim world, the greatest threat perhaps to Israel, a unified front, no divisions between Shia, Sunni, and others. And you have a unified Muslim world saying, down with Israel?
Well, normally the Israelis are very good at practicing economy of enemies. They've always been good at that. Deal with one at a time if you can and turn your potential opponents against each other. Unfortunately, this time, they've done the opposite, and we're helping them to do it over and over and over again every day, and that is that they've united the opposition. You're absolutely right. Now, is MBS in charge of it? I think has a very influential role because of his position in Saudi Arabia, which is effectively for Muslims the equivalent of the Holy Land. So what he says carries great weight. But you've got other actors. Qatar has funded not only Hamas, but also Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. Without Qatari funding, the Turks would be in serious economic trouble. So there are other actors that are playing into this, and you shouldn't underestimate General Sisi in Egypt. The Egyptians have maintained very good relations with the Israelis, but their government cannot survive what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. And the pressure on him to mobilize his army and go forward and fight potentially to protect the Gazans is enormous. Now, if you're an Israeli and you're angry and you're emoting about what you've seen, you may not be satisfied when you've killed 10,000 more or 20,000 more Palestinians, but you've got to have someone who is rational in charge. Everyone is emoting right now. We are emoting, the Israelis are emoting, and so are the Muslims. Emotion is the killer. Emotion leads to bad decisions and bad outcomes. What's needed now is cool, calm, collected thinking. And we need to understand that however much we hate Hamas, taking the current approach is the road to Armageddon in the Middle East. And we haven't even talked about nuclear weapons. And people don't seem to understand that, of course, the Israelis have a nuclear weapon, and they've made it abundantly clear that if pushed to the wall, that they would use it. But they forget that, for instance, Turkey has very close relations with the Pakistani military. The Pakistani military and government has made it clear repeatedly over many, many years that if the Turks need nuclear warheads to protect themselves, they will receive them. So you're talking about a double envelopment, if you will. You're not only dealing with the high-end conventional warfare, the introduction of all these missiles and rockets and unmanned aircraft, you're also dealing with this evil shadow of nuclear exchange hovering over the region. So I keep advising anyone who will listen, back off. Think about this carefully. And I'm very grateful that the Israelis to this point have not yet gone in. That gives us breathing space. We need that.
Secretary Blinken yesterday said that he sees no indication that Israel wants to control Gaza in perpetuity. Do you buy that?
Gaza has been a huge problem for a long time. Many Americans are unaware of it, but during the Camp David Accords discussions, Menachem Begin actually offered Sadat Gaza, said, please take it off our hands. We don't want it. And at the time, Sadat said, I've got so many problems inside my own country, I can't take on any more. As a result, Gaza has been this island of misery and misfortune. Now, you could certainly blame that to some extent on the inhabitants, but people have referred to it, not without reason, as the world's largest open-air prison or concentration camp. Now, the Israelis have had to take stringent measures to protect themselves because Gaza is a permanent thorn in their sides. So I don't think they want it. I think they would like to remove it. The problem is if you push 2 million or 1.5 million or whatever it turns out to be Arabs into the Sinai, which is the real plan I think the Israelis would like to follow, you've just pushed the problem 20 miles away.
Right.
Hamas is more than people. It's an idea. It is steeped in hatred, but it is widely regarded in the Middle East because they will not surrender.
It's a hydra, right? Is it fair to call it a hydra? I mean, and it's not even top down from what I understand. It's not like you have some leader sitting at the top. You have a multiple headed hydra that you cut one head off, it'll just keep popping up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the Israelis understand that, but their only solution is force. I think you have to somehow or another rob Hamas and others of their raison d'etre. Now, how do you do that? Well, you've got to reopen discussions about the future of the Palestinians, which is something else the Israelis don't want to do. They don't want a two-state solution. They regard that as a threat to themselves. And you have a substantial portion of the people supporting Netanyahu who think this is their opportunity to create a greater Israel that reaches from the Jordan River to the sea. Now, I understand all of these things. I'm an American. I'm not an Israeli. And I'm not unsympathetic. But I don't think it serves Israel's interest to pursue these goals. And if they do, we and they are going to be drawn into a very large regional war in the Middle East. And what have we got to send? We can certainly send ships, although you've got 90 aircraft on each aircraft carrier, of which 40 or 50 are attack aircraft. You have a flotilla that's there largely to protect the carriers so they can launch their strikes, but they're also operating from a very long way offshore, so far that they may have to land in Israel after executing their strikes to refuel. Then they're up against air defenses. Now, the air defenses that are there are Russian, but they're also part of Syria. those air defenses can be turned to use against us. So we'll probably lose aircraft. Then the question is, if you can't influence things on the ground in Israel, what can you do? We have no army. We really have no army anymore. It's down to about 450,000. It's a shadow of its former self. If you can't put forces on the ground, you're not going to change anything. And the Israelis, again, they're talking about a force of 470,000 to 500,000. That's larger than the U.S. Army. 2,000 Marines offshore, 2,000 special forces working with the Israelis are not going to win a war.
And so, yeah, we look at being dragged into a larger absolute mess right now. Armageddon, to use your word. Colonel, I want to encourage everyone to read your latest piece on this. I think it's really interesting and thoughtful, and it raises some really serious questions. You know, if possible, that Israel could wind up like Ukraine if we don't watch out as this unfolds here. Thank you so much, Colonel. Great to see you as always. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.